The dust-laden wind howled through the cracks of the weathered cabin as Elizabeth Morgan clutched her newborn to her chest, the cries of her 5 other hungry children echoing against the bare walls. It was 1876 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and winter had come early to Douglas, bringing with it the cruel bite of starvation that Elizabeth had been dreading since her husband's passing 3 months prior. "Hush now, little ones," she soothed, though her own stomach twisted with hunger. "Something will come our way soon." Elizabeth had been managing barely since Thomas had been thrown from his horse and broken his neck. The small garden had yielded just enough through summer, and the odd sewing jobs from town had brought in pennies. But now, with snow already dusting the ground in early November, her pantry stood empty save for a handful of dried beans and a small sack of cornmeal that wouldn't last the week. 6-year-old Abigail, the eldest, stood by the window, her small frame silhouetted against the fading light. "Ma, someone's coming," she said, her breath fogging the glass. Elizabeth shifted baby Joseph in her arms and peered through the frost-edged window. A lone rider approached, his broad-shouldered figure cutting a dark shape against the snow-covered landscape. Her heart quickened. Strangers could mean danger for a woman alone with children, but they could also mean salvation. "Stay inside," she instructed the children, placing Joseph in his makeshift cradle. She reached for the shotgun Thomas had taught her to use, tucking it behind the door where she could reach it quickly if needed. The knock came firm but not threatening. Elizabeth smoothed her apron, took a steadying breath, and opened the door just enough to see the visitor's face. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 to her 28 years, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. His eyes, a deep blue that reminded her of summer skies, crinkled at the corners as he removed his hat. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow put her at ease. "Name's Caleb Ingram. My horse picked up a stone a mile back. I saw your chimney smoke. Might I trouble you for some water and a place to tend to his hoof?" Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before widening the door. A man with concern for his horse was unlikely to mean them harm. "Of course, Mr. Ingram," the wells around back. "Much obliged," he said with a nod, leading his chestnut gelding toward the rear of the cabin. 4-year-old twins Samuel and Sarah peeked from behind Elizabeth's skirts, while Abigail held 2-year-old Daniel's hand firmly. 5-year-old William stood protectively near the baby's cradle. When Caleb returned, he paused at the threshold, taking in the sight of the 6 children and the barren room. His gaze lingered on the empty hearth where a meager fire struggled to provide warmth. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. "Passed this August," Elizabeth replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Horse accident." Caleb's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." He glanced at the children again, noting their hollow cheeks and the way Elizabeth's dress hung loose on her frame. "Forgive my boldness, but it looks like you folks could use a hot meal." Elizabeth's pride warred with her desperation. "We manage," she said, but her voice wavered. Caleb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a package wrapped in oilcloth. "I've got some jerky and dried apples. Not much of a supper, but I'd be honored to share." The children's eyes widened at the mention of food, and Elizabeth felt her resistance crumbling. "That's very kind, Mr. Ingram." As Caleb laid out his modest provisions on the rough-hewn table, Elizabeth set water to boil, adding the last of her cornmeal to make a thin gruel that would stretch the meal further. "I'm trailing a herd to Douglas," Caleb explained as they worked. "Cattle baron from Texas bought land up here. I'm to help establish the ranch." "That would be the old Peterson place," Elizabeth said, stirring the pot. "About 3 miles east," Caleb nodded. "The boss sent me ahead to survey, rest of the outfit's a day behind." He watched as Elizabeth distributed the food with careful precision, ensuring each child received an equal share. "She had 6 children and no bread," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, with a decisive nod, he stood. "If you'll excuse me, madam, I need to check on my horse." When he returned, he carried his bedroll and another bag. "I've got provisions in my saddlebags, enough for a proper breakfast tomorrow. With your permission, I'll sleep in your barn tonight and be on my way at first light." Elizabeth felt relief wash over her. One more meal for her children was a blessing she hadn't dared hope for. The barn isn't much, but you're welcome to it, Mr. Ingram. As the children settled for the night, huddled together for warmth on the single bed they shared, Elizabeth found Caleb by the barn door, smoking a cigarette. "Thank you," she said simply, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "For the food." Caleb extinguished his cigarette and nodded. No one should go hungry, especially not children. He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said about breakfast. But I was thinking if you're amenable, I could bring more supplies. The outfit I'm with has plenty." Elizabeth felt a flush of shame. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Ingram." "Not charity," he said quickly. "An arrangement, I hear you so. The men will need mending and such, and—" He glanced toward the cabin. "If you'd be willing to cook a meal now and again for the hands, I'm sure the boss would see fair payment." Hope flickered in Elizabeth's chest. "I'd be much obliged for the work, Mr. Ingram." True to his word, Caleb returned the next morning with flour, bacon, coffee, and a dozen eggs. Elizabeth cooked a breakfast the likes of which her children hadn't seen in months, watching with a mother's joy as they ate their fill. Before Caleb left, he helped her split enough wood to last several days and promised to return with more supplies and word about the cooking arrangement. 3 days later, as Elizabeth was teaching Abigail to darn socks, the sound of horses drew them to the window. Caleb rode at the head of a small group, leading a wagon laden with provisions. "Mrs. Morgan," he called as she stepped onto the porch, "I've spoken with Mr. Harrington, the ranch owner. He's agreed to $1 a week for your cooking services plus supplies. We've brought some essentials to tide you over." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes as the men unloaded sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, beans, and even a small crate of apples. There was salt pork, dried beef, and to the children's delight hard candies wrapped in twisted paper. "This is too much," she protested, but Caleb shook his head. "The men need good food and you need provisions for your family. It's a fair trade." And so began a new routine. 3 times a week, Caleb or one of the other hands would come to collect whatever Elizabeth had prepared: hearty stews, fresh bread, occasionally pies when there was fruit to be had. In return, they ensured her pantry remained stocked and her woodpile high. As winter deepened, Caleb's visits became more frequent. He often arrived with small treasures for the children: a carved wooden horse for William, hair ribbons for Abigail and Sarah, a picture book for the twins to share. For Elizabeth, he brought practical gifts: new needles, good thread, a sturdy cooking pot to replace her cracked one on Christmas Eve. He appeared with a small fir tree strapped to his saddle and a burlap sack filled with simple presents. The children's delighted faces as they hung paper chains and dried apple slices on the tree melted something in Elizabeth's heart that had been frozen since Thomas's death. Later, as the children slept, Caleb and Elizabeth sat by the fire, sharing a rare cup of coffee laced with whiskey he'd brought. "Why are you doing all this?" she finally asked, the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. Caleb stared into the flames. "I had a sister," he said quietly. "Catherine. Her husband died in the war, left her with 4 little ones. I was riding with a cattle drive, sending money when I could. Got word too late that they'd all taken sick with diphtheria." His voice roughened. "By the time I reached them, I was burying 5 coffins instead of helping them live." Elizabeth reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his. "I'm sorry." "When I saw you and your children that day," he continued, turning his hand to hold hers, "I thought perhaps God was giving me a second chance to do right by a family in need." "You've done more than right by us," Elizabeth said softly. "You've saved us." The firelight caught the shimmer of unshed tears in his eyes. "No, Mrs. Morgan, you've saved me." As winter gave way to spring, Caleb's role in their lives evolved. He taught William and Samuel how to fish in the creek that ran behind the property. He fixed the leaking roof and reinforced the barn walls. And increasingly, he found reasons to linger after delivering supplies or collecting food for the ranch hands. Elizabeth found herself watching for his arrival, her heart quickening at the sound of hoofbeats. The children, too, had grown attached, running to meet him whenever he appeared on the horizon. One crisp March evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while the children played in the yard, Caleb cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Morgan Elizabeth, if I may, I've been offered a permanent position as foreman at the Harrington Ranch. That's wonderful news, she said, genuinely pleased for him. Yes, well, he continued, twisting his hat in his hands, it comes with a cabin, a good-sized one, 3 rooms, solid roof. Room enough for a family. Elizabeth's breath caught. Mr. Ingram, Caleb, please. Caleb, she amended, her voice barely above a whisper. What exactly are you saying? He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. I'm saying that I've grown to care deeply for you and your children. I'm saying that if you'd consider it, I'd like to court you properly, with the intention of offering you and the children a home and my name. Elizabeth felt warmth bloom in her chest, but caution tempered her response. The children and I are grateful for all you've done, but I wouldn't want your pity or your sense of obligation to be mistaken for deeper feelings. Pity, Caleb looked genuinely surprised. Elizabeth, what I feel for you is admiration, respect, and something more that grows stronger every day. As for the children, I couldn't love them more if they were my own flesh and blood. He took her hand gently. I know it hasn't been long since you lost Thomas. I know your heart might not be ready. But I'm a patient man, and I'll wait as long as it takes, if there's any chance you might someday return my feelings. Elizabeth looked out at her children, seeing how they had flourished under Caleb's care these past months. She thought of Thomas, of the love they had shared, and knew he would have wanted her and the children to be cared for, to be happy. I think, she said carefully, that my heart is healing faster than I expected. She met his gaze. I would be honored to accept your courtship, Caleb. The smile that lit his face was like sunrise after the longest night. Spring turned to summer, and with Caleb's help, Elizabeth planted a larger garden than she'd ever managed before. The children grew stronger and happier, their laughter a constant backdrop to days filled with purpose and increasingly with joy. Caleb courted her with respectful devotion, bringing wildflowers and taking her for buggy rides on Sunday afternoons while one of the ranch hands' wives watched the children. They talked of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. With each conversation, each shared smile, the bond between them deepened. By July, Elizabeth knew she was falling in love with him. The realization didn't come with guilt or confusion, but with a sense of rightness, as if this was exactly where life had been leading her. On a warm evening, as fireflies danced in the gathering dusk, Caleb asked William, as the eldest boy, for permission to marry his mother. Solemn-faced, William considered the request before breaking into a wide grin and throwing his arms around Caleb's neck. With the children's enthusiastic blessing secured, Caleb knelt before Elizabeth on the porch steps and offered her a simple gold band. I'm not a wealthy man, he said, and I can't promise life will always be easy. But I can promise to love you and these children until my dying day, to provide for you, protect you, and cherish you through whatever comes our way. Elizabeth Morgan, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Tears of happiness spilled down Elizabeth's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, Caleb. Yes, with all my heart. They were married in August, a small ceremony in Douglas's newly built church. Mr. Harrington gave the bride away, and all 6 children participated in the service, their faces shining with happiness as their mother and the man who had saved them from starvation pledged their lives to one another. The cabin on the Harrington Ranch was indeed spacious compared to Elizabeth's old home. Caleb had worked tirelessly to prepare it, building new beds for the children, putting up shelves for Elizabeth's few treasures, even planting flowers along the pathway to welcome her. On their first evening there, after the children had been tucked into their new beds, Caleb led Elizabeth to the kitchen table where 7 plates were set out. 7, she questioned. But there are 8 of us now. Caleb smiled, that warm smile that never failed to make her heart skip. Do you remember the first day we met? I looked at you and your 6 hungry children and thought to myself, she has 6 children and no bread, and I decided then and there, 7 plates it shall be, 1 for each of your children and 1 for you. Elizabeth was puzzled. But you'll need a plate too. He reached into a cupboard and produced an 8th plate. I know, but that day, all I could think about was making sure you and the children had enough. It became a sort of promise to myself that you would never go hungry again, that there would always be 7 full plates in your home. Elizabeth rose on tiptoe to kiss him, marveling at the way life could change so completely in less than a year. Their first months of marriage were a time of adjustment and deepening bonds. Caleb proved to be a patient and loving stepfather, firm when necessary but always kind. The children thrived under his guidance, especially the boys, who blossomed with the male attention they had been missing. Elizabeth found joy in creating a home for her expanded family, in watching Caleb teach William to ride, in seeing baby Joseph take his first steps toward the man he already called Papa. Her days were still filled with work, cooking, cleaning, sewing, but now there was a partner to share the burden, to hold her when she was tired, to laugh with her when the twins got into mischief. The wider community of Douglas began to know them as a family unit, not as the widow Morgan and her brood, but as the Ingrams. Elizabeth felt herself standing taller, smiling more easily, letting go of the constant worry that had been her companion for so long. One evening in early spring, nearly a year after they had met, Elizabeth sat on the porch with Caleb after the children were asleep, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat stomach. "Come winter, we'll need another plate at the table." The joy that transformed Caleb's face was something Elizabeth knew she would remember all her days. He gathered her in his arms, laughing and crying at once, peppering her face with kisses. "A baby," he whispered in awe. "Our baby." Elizabeth nodded, her own eyes wet with happy tears. "Our seventh child, the first of our joining." "Are you happy, truly?" Caleb asked, suddenly serious. "With 7 children to care for, happier than I ever dreamed possible," she assured him, "and they'll have the most wonderful father to guide them." As Elizabeth's pregnancy progressed, the family prepared for its newest member. Abigail, now 7, took on more responsibility, proud to help her mother. William and Samuel, under Caleb's direction, built a cradle from wood harvested on the ranch. Even little Joseph seemed to understand something special was happening, patting Elizabeth's growing belly and saying "baby" with his limited vocabulary. The community embraced the news as well. The Harringtons sent a beautiful quilt. The ranch hands' wives organized a small gathering to present Elizabeth with baby clothes and practical gifts. The town's doctor promised to attend the birth, a luxury Elizabeth hadn't had with Joseph, whom she delivered with only the help of a neighbor woman. Caleb threw himself into preparations with characteristic thoroughness, expanding their cabin to add another small bedroom, stocking extra supplies for winter, and setting aside a portion of each paycheck for the future. At night, he would talk to the baby, telling stories and making promises while Elizabeth watched, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had transformed their lives. In December, as the first heavy snow of winter blanketed the landscape, Elizabeth went into labor. The children were sent to stay with the foreman's wife in the main house, while the doctor was fetched from town. The birth was difficult but uncomplicated. After hours of labor, with Caleb holding her hand and whispering encouragement, Elizabeth delivered a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. "Christopher," she whispered, cradling him to her chest. "Christopher Thomas Ingram." Caleb, his face wet with tears, kissed her forehead reverently. "He's perfect. You're perfect." When the doctor had gone and Elizabeth and the baby were resting comfortably, Caleb brought the other children in to meet their new brother. They crowded around the bed, faces alight with wonder as they peered at the tiny infant. "He's so small," William marveled. "Was I that small?" asked Daniel. "Even smaller," Elizabeth told him with a smile. That night, with the children finally asleep and the new baby settled in his cradle beside their bed, Caleb sat beside Elizabeth, holding her hand. "Do you remember what I said about the 7 plates?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded, too tired to speak but content beyond words. "Well, now we really do need 8, he said with a soft laugh, "though it'll be a while before Christopher needs his own." "I was thinking," Elizabeth said, her voice drowsy but determined, "that perhaps we should get a few extra just in case." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "In case of what?" "In case God blesses us with more children of our own," she said, squeezing his hand. I think we make beautiful babies together. Caleb's laugh was joyful as he bent to kiss her. As many as you want, my love. Our table will always have room for one more plate. 5 years later, the Ingram household was indeed using all 10 of the plates Elizabeth had optimistically purchased after Christopher's birth. In addition to her original 6 and Christopher, they had been blessed with twin girls, Emma and Charlotte, now 3 years old. The Harrington Ranch had prospered, and Caleb had been given shares in the business, providing the family with security they had once only dreamed of. The older children were receiving proper education in the town's school, and Abigail, now 12, was showing a talent for teaching that suggested a bright future. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Caleb always prepared a special meal, setting out 7 plates first before adding the 8th, 9th, and 10th, a reminder of how far they had come from that desperate day when a hungry widow and her 6 children had touched the heart of a lonely cowboy. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked him once as they watched their brood playing in the yard of what was now a substantial house, built on land Caleb had purchased adjacent to the Harrington property. "Regret what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled, taking on so much. "6 children not your own, a widow with nothing to offer but mouths to feed." Caleb pulled her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been when he first held her. "Elizabeth Ingram, the day I rode up to your cabin was the luckiest day of my life. You and those children gave me purpose when I had none, love when I thought it wasn't meant for me. You offered me the greatest gift a man could ask for a family." He kissed her tenderly, then rested his forehead against hers. 7 plates, 8 plates, 20 plates, I would fill them all gladly, as long as you're sitting at the table with me." And as their children's laughter rang out across the Wyoming prairie, Elizabeth knew that from the darkest moment of her life had come the greatest blessing, a love that had not only filled empty plates, but had nourished her soul and given her children a future brighter than she could have imagined that cold, desperate day when a kind cowboy had ridden into their lives. Their story became something of a legend in Douglas and the surrounding areas. The widow with 6 children and the cowboy who had said, "7 plates it shall be," only to end up with a table full of love, laughter, and more plates than anyone had counted on. It was a testament to how life's harshest moments could, with faith and courage, lead to the greatest joys, and how love could grow from the simple act of filling an empty plate.